I want to go over some of the ways that I've been looking at managing state within imba and maybe get some feedback from what people think about this. So I've created a very simple counter component here, and it just sets a counter value on the tag. And then when you click, it sets the counter value equal to count plus 1 or count minus 1. And then this just displays the count. And we can see that it works in the browser. And so you may ask, well, what's wrong with this? This seems very elegant, and it is. This kind of shows the power of imba, how clean and elegant and straightforward this is. But I found myself wanting to separate out the logic of my tag when this started to get more complicated. So this example, it's so simple, you can follow it all very easily. But I started to create an example where I had much more state values, and I had a lot of logic that calculated the values that got used in the view. So I had something where you click down, you mouse out, mouse back in. If you mouse up on the original element, it does one thing. If you quickly click twice in a row, it does something different. And all the logic to figure out, there's a lot of calculations involved, and I have hundreds of lines of code that would all be kind of within this tag. I don't want all that logic in here because I'd like this to be my view essentially, and just focus on the markup and the styling and things like that. So I was trying to figure out ways to separate out the logic and figure out what's the nicest way to do it. I mean, it's easy enough to do that. I don't really have this problem, but I wanted to figure out a nice way to do it that felt comfortable. And we've discussed a few different ways, like on the Discord, and I'll go over some of those. So one way to do it is to use a base class that has all the logic in it. So I could say base counter. And in here, we could say count equals 0, and we could say increment count equals count plus 1, decrement. And so that's all the logic for this. And I won't put any view here. And then this counter, instead of having a count here, it will inherit from base counter. And this function here will instead just call increment and decrement. All right, so this is pretty nice because I've now separated out the logic. I could have other types of counters that also inherit this logic. So you could change the view very easily that way. I could make a new counter with a different type of view, different HTML, different styling, and it would work. And if this logic got really complicated, it would be separated from this view code. So what are the downsides? I think one of the and another thing I really like is that I'm using increment, decrement, count without any sort of special like foo.count, which you'll see some potential solutions might require that. So I like that. It's very clean. But there's two downsides that I see. One is it's harder to reuse this. Like I can't use multiple. I can't inherit from another thing. You know, if I had this is like my counter logic. If I wanted to have something that was like logic for mouse movement or something, I can't inherit from two. Also, the values in here are kind of hidden away from me. What I mean by that is, where does increment come from? If I'm just looking at this tag, I don't see increment anywhere. So I don't really see it as an available value that I can use. You know, maybe I'm going to override it here by accident because I don't know what I'm doing. I have to look through here to check to make sure. And if I have hundreds of lines of code of logic in here, then I could easily accidentally override something or have trouble finding what's available. So those are two downsides I see. But I mean, this is pretty clean. If you could inherit from multiple things, maybe it would be really nice. And if you had maybe auto completion of properties stored on a base class, then maybe it would make it easier to find those. That could be pretty nice. But let's look at another strategy. What if instead of a tag, this was a class? And then instead of inheriting from it, I can set it here. So I could say, let's say logic equals new base counter. And instead of base counter, I'll call it count logic. Okay. Now this sort of solves two of the problems I had. Well, I have to put logic here and like that. Make sure that works. Now the cool thing here is I could have logic 2 and that's a separate count logic. And I could say logic2.count. That's a separate count. I could control that with, different looking buttons. Maybe on this one, I want to say click equals logic2.increment. So clicking directly on it increments it. I can reuse that logic in a new way within the same tag. That's great. Also, it's kind of explicit. The values on this object are not explicit. I don't see increment written down anywhere here, but at least I've created this thing called logic that I'm calling here, where in the previous example, I would just say increment, and it's a little bit like, where'd that come from? Because it came from the base class. It's hidden away. So I like that this is more explicit. I like that I can use two of them. I still see some downsides here. One is that I would like to not have to put this. Let's go back to this. Let's remove this logic 2 stuff. I would like to not have to put logic.increment. I'd like to just say increment. And I don't want to have to go through and put logic or, increment equals logic.increment. It's kind of messy. And I kind of just don't like using classes. I feel like, I don't know if I can accurately describe what bothers me about using classes, but let's just move on to the next example and I'll show you another way that this can work. So this next way, I'm just gonna hide this away down here, comment it out. So in this next way, we're gonna say no properties on the tag, but in the render method, I'm gonna say count set count equals use state 0. So what is use state? Where did that come from? I haven't shown you that yet. It's a function that I implemented, but it's stolen from React. It's an idea from React, and everybody, using imba rightly feels like, oh man, React has so many downsides compared to imba. Why would you want to take this thing from React? And I'm trying to figure out, is there some value in this? This is a React hook syntax. So it's like, is there some value from React? Is this hooks thing, built to account for React's downsides, or does it have its own value? So I'm trying to explore that. Let's just see how it works here. So instead of logic.increment, I can say set count plus 1, and set count minus 1, and back here, count. Use state's not defined. So I've defined it and I'm going to import it, and we won't talk about exactly how it's implemented. Okay, so we see that works. Let's talk about what's good and what's bad about this. What's nice here is count and set count are really explicitly laid out for me. And when I use them, there's no foo.setCount, it's just set count. And I think that's very beautiful. The inputs are laid out here. So this is an initial value. And you can have a second one of these. So I could say count2, set count 2. And again, let's do our weird example here. Set count 2 plus 1. So now clicking on this one, and this will be count 2 displayed. So I'm able to use that same logic of, well, in this case, it's not any logic, it's just the state twice within the same component, or multiple times. So it's nice that it's reusable, which again, wasn't possible with the inheritance method. Now all this does is store my state. I could have just easily stored that on the tag here. So what's the point? The point is that you can remove, you can take a larger chunk of logic and move it into its own separated hook, to use the React terminology, because these hooks are composable. So I can reuse this use state in another hook. So let's implement another hook. We can make a function called use counter with an initial value, and we're going to implement it in a second, but let's say it's going to be something like this. We're going to destructure the return value from that, which would be increment, decrement, and count, like the current count, equals use count and then an initial value. So this is going to return an increment function, decrement function, and current count. So count is going to be count set count equals use state initial. The increment function is going to be set count plus 1. This is just like what we did before within the function, or within the tag. Okay. Why isn't it like this? This.useCount is not a function. Oh. Okay, use count instead of use counter. All right, so now I've moved all the logic of this counter, not just the state, but the entire logic of like what it means to increment and decrement. And then, you know, the inputs are sent into this function, and the outputs that you get are all the things that you need for the view and nothing else. You know, in the case of a class, you might have to be really careful to not, you know, to mark all your properties as private if they should be private. Same thing with the inheritance model. You know, maybe there's a bunch of intermediate properties that shouldn't be accessed by this view. And you have to mark those as private and make sure that it's all set up right. In this case, it's very explicit that you're only returning things that need to be seen by the view. So let's make sure it works. No, it doesn't work. Oh, so down here, instead of this set count stuff, I can now replace this with my increment function and my decrement function, and this is the same name, count. So, you know, this returns an object with 3 items. Those items are destructured here, these different places. Cool, so that works. And you can, again, use 2 of these. You could have a separate counter that maybe starts at a different value. So I'm just gonna say like inc2 count 2, and I don't need to use the decrement here because I'm just gonna have an increment button. I'll say click equals inc2 count 2. Okay, it's not showing up. Oh, because it's not called that. I don't know if you can do this in imba, like set a different name. Okay, cool, you can. All right, sweet. So now I have my counter at the bottom and this separate counter at the top that has a different way of working, but they're both using the same use count logic because this is such a generic set of logic. You know, it's the whole component. It's all the interactions of clicking and displaying, but without any of the actual UI, right? The displaying is count, the clicking is these, but it doesn't have to be click. It could be some other thing that triggers it. So it's totally decoupled from the view. It seems very clean and very nice to me. Again, you can use multiple of them. The names of the things are explicitly laid out. You don't need any kind of like prefix like foo.count as you would with like a class instance. And these are composable. So, you know, state, I use the use state hook within here, and I could use the use count hook within another thing, if that made sense. I don't know. I think it's pretty elegant. It's kind of nice. I would love to hear though why it's not good, and or how we could do it better, how imba enables a better way to do this. Like, can we do it without set, you know? And there's an article which I'll link somewhere. Here's this article that explains how this useState hook is implemented in React and gives like a simple implementation of it. And I copied the code almost exactly, but I would love to be told why this is a silly thing to do and why there's a much better way and a better imba way, because I would like to get the benefits of a simple function call, being able to use this twice, having the names laid out explicitly, separating the logic from my view. I feel like these are a lot of benefits that I can't quite recreate with any other technique. So I would love for someone to tell me how to get something this clean or even better in maybe an easier to set up way, maybe without even having to implement something like useState. And if you do use this kind of model, you can potentially define your tags entirely as functions. So this is just a simple function, does some calculation, in this case using a hook, and returns some markup. This is kind of what happened in React. They went from using classes only to allowing functions as well, and that was kind of enabled by hooks. And I think this is like as simple as you could get for implementing a component.